Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were on a plane to Pakistan. Trump called them back, and the reason he gave the press was not the reason he gave his national security team. What did the intelligence community tell Trump in the 2 hours before the recall that changed his calculation entirely? And why does sending Witkoff and Kushner specifically rather than career diplomats signal something about this negotiation that Tehran was reading very carefully? This is not a story about a canceled trip. Canceled trips happen. This is a story about what the canceled trip reveals about the internal state of the most sensitive back-channel negotiation currently running between two countries that are 4 decisions away from a shooting war. Witkoff and Kushner are not State Department officials. They are not career Foreign Service. They are Trump's personal envoys, men whose authority derives entirely from their personal relationship with the president, whose presence in a negotiation signals not institutional American foreign policy but Trump's direct personal engagement. When Trump sends them, he is saying, "I am in this negotiation." When Trump recalls them mid-flight, he is saying something else. And what he is saying is not what the press statement says. Here is the board. The Islamabad relay Pakistan as intermediary between Washington and Tehran, carrying language that neither side will put in writing, has been the only functional de-escalation architecture in the current crisis. Every formal channel has failed or frozen. The Swiss line handles prisoner notifications. Oman went quiet after the back-channel collapse. What remained was Pakistan's unique dual access, a working relationship with US Central Command's liaison structure on one side and a 3-decade institutional channel between ISI and the Urd Quds force on the other. Into that relay, Trump had inserted his 2 most trusted personal envoys, not to observe, to close, to bring back an answer that career diplomats couldn't be trusted to interpret correctly, couldn't be trusted to deliver faithfully, and couldn't be trusted to keep out of the interagency process long enough to actually function. He recalled them before they landed. That tells you the answer wasn't ready, or the answer arrived early, or the answer was something nobody wanted received on Pakistani soil. To understand why Witkoff and Kushner were chosen for this specific mission, you need to understand the architecture of Trump's foreign policy decision-making in a crisis which operates on a fundamentally different logic than any previous administration's. Career diplomats, in Trump's model, are institutional actors whose first loyalty is to process to the interagency system, to the paper trail, to the permanent bureaucratic record that survives any individual administration. They negotiate within parameters set by committees. They report to chains of command that include people Trump doesn't trust, doesn't like, and has spent for years publicly undermining. In a negotiation this sensitive, where the specific language of Iran's response, the precise framing of any de-escalation framework, the exact sequencing of concessions and counter-concessions needs to be received, interpreted, and reported back to Trump without being filtered through an interagency process that would leak within 48 hours. Career diplomats are not an option. Witkoff and Kushner don't report to the interagency process. They report to Trump directly, verbally, in terms that Trump has shaped and can act on without a 6-week committee review. Their presence in a negotiation compresses the decision cycle in a way that no institutional actor can replicate, and in a situation where the carrier deployment's operational sustainment window is running, where the window between credible military presence and face-saving withdrawal is measured in days, not weeks. That compression is not a feature of the diplomatic approach. It is the entire point. Tehran read their presence correctly. Iran's foreign ministry, in the 48 hours before the recall, had been tracking the Witkoff-Kushner travel itinerary through channels that are not difficult to imagine: commercial flight manifests, diplomatic notification protocols, the normal apparatus of intelligence collection that any competent foreign intelligence service runs against the travel patterns of senior officials. What Tehran concluded from the tracking was this: Trump is personally engaged. The envoys are authorized to make commitments that career diplomats cannot make. This is not a listening exercise. This is a closing exercise. Iran's response to that reading was not to accelerate its answer. It was to slow it down. Slow it down deliberately. Slowing down is Iran's most powerful negotiating tool in a time-constrained situation. The carrier sustainment clock runs against Washington, not Tehran. Iran does not need a framework within 21 days. Washington does, because without a framework, the carrier deployment either escalates or retreats, and either outcome damages American deterrence in a way that takes years to rebuild. Iran's optimal play Once it identified that Trump was sending personal envoys to close a deal, was to make the closing impossible within the available window, not by refusing to negotiate, but by introducing conditions, complications, and internal political dynamics that make the delivery of a clean, actionable answer impossible before the window expires. The slowing is the move. The answer that never quite arrives is the weapon. What specific condition did Iran introduce in the final 48 hours that made Witkoff and Kushner's arrival in Islamabad produce a worse outcome than their absence? The intelligence community's input, the thing Trump was told in the 2 hours before the recall that changed his calculation, connects directly to that condition based on the available evidence. The timing of the recall relative to Iranian state media output, the specific language Trump used in his public statement, and the pattern of behavior from Iraqi's office in the hours preceding the decision. What the intelligence community told Trump was not that the negotiation had failed. It was that Iran had restructured its answer in a way that would make Witkoff and Kushner's receipt of it in Islamabad, in person, with their authority to commit Trump directly, a strategic liability rather than an asset. Here is why that restructuring matters. When Witkoff and Kushner receive an answer, they are not receiving it as institutional intermediaries who can say, "We will take this back to Washington for review." They are receiving it as Trump's personal envoys, which means their reception of the answer implicitly commits Trump to a response. Any answer they receive, they own. Any condition embedded in that answer becomes a condition that Trump has been informed of through his personal representatives, which means Iran can subsequently claim that Trump's failure to meet the condition is a deliberate American bad faith act rather than a bureaucratic delay. The personal envoy architecture, which is its greatest strength in a closing exercise, becomes its greatest vulnerability when the other side introduces conditions designed to be unacceptable. Strength inverted into vulnerability by one move. The condition Iran introduced, again, not confirmed in open source reporting but reconstructible from the pattern, involves the sequencing of the maritime framework. Washington's ask had been structured as Iran releases the Atlantic Navigator 2 as a verifiable first step, then a broader framework discussion follows. Iran's restructured answer reverses that sequence. Iran wants the framework discussion first, specifically a commitment from Washington on the sanctions snapback mechanism, the UN Security Council vote whose 90-day window is closing, and the maritime release follows as a consequence of that commitment, not a precondition to it. That reversal is not a negotiating position adjustment. It is a structural change that transforms the entire nature of the agreement Washington was trying to reach. Because the snapback mechanism, the U.S. ability to reimpose multilateral sanctions on Iran without a Security Council majority, is not something Witkoff and Kushner can commit to in Islamabad. It requires congressional notification. It involves treaty obligations. It touches the JPOA's legal architecture in ways that the State Department's legal team has been arguing about for 2 years. It is precisely the kind of commitment that requires the interagency process that Trump's personal envoy model was designed to bypass. Iran found the one condition that the personal envoy model cannot accommodate, and it embedded that condition in its answer 48 hours before Witkoff and Kushner were scheduled to land. Here is what the recall actually accomplishes, and it is not a retreat. By recalling Witkoff and Kushner before they land, Trump does 3 things simultaneously. First, he prevents them from receiving a conditional answer that would commit him to a snapback discussion he hasn't authorized and can't deliver in the available time frame. Second, he signals to Tehran that the personal envoy architecture is not infinitely exploitable, that introducing conditions designed to paralyze the personal commitment mechanism will result in the mechanism being withdrawn rather than the conditions being accepted. Third, he preserves the option to reinsert Witkoff and Kushner into the process once the snapback condition has been either addressed or explicitly rejected, which requires a different level of internal Washington deliberation than a personal envoy visit can substitute for. The recall is not a retreat from the negotiation. It is a refusal to be maneuvered into a position where receiving Iran's answer is worse than not receiving it. That is a precise and sophisticated response to Iran's restructuring move, sophisticated enough that it almost certainly reflects input from someone in Trump's circle who understood exactly what Iran had done and why. That person is not Witkoff. It is not Kushner. It is someone who has been watching Iran's negotiating patterns for long enough to recognize a snapback trap when it arrives dressed as a diplomatic concession. The snapback trap, Let's be precise about what Iran gains by embedding the snapback condition in its answer and then watching the personal envoys get recalled. It gains a narrative. In Iranian state media, in the Irg political faction's communication to the hardline parliamentary bloc, in the Supreme Leader's office's reading of American Resolve, the recall of Witkoff and Kushner is evidence that Washington cannot deliver on its commitments, that Trump's personal envoy model, celebrated in American media as a deal-making innovation, collapsed the moment Iran asked for something substantive. That narrative is worth more to Iran's domestic political situation, to the Irg faction that has been attacking the Iraqi relay from the inside, than any military action could produce. The domestic Iranian political dimension of the recall cannot be overstated. The Irg faction that has been attacking the Iraqi relay, characterizing it as evidence of American desperation, calling any maritime release framework a gift to sanctions architects, just received the most powerful validation available: the personal envoys of the American president were recalled mid-flight. In Iranian hardline political culture, that is not read as a tactical adjustment. It is read as a retreat, and a retreat in that culture is an invitation to push harder. The Irg faction will use the recall to argue to Khomeini's office that the diplomatic track has served its purpose, that it has extracted a demonstration of American vulnerability, and that the escalation track should now resume from a position of strengthened leverage. That argument, made to Khomeini's arbitration in the aftermath of the recall, is the most dangerous development in the current crisis. Not the carrier deployment, not the maritime seizures, not the coalition withdrawals. The argument being made right now in Tehran, that the recall of Witkoff and Kushner proves that Washington's red lines are negotiable and its commitments are unreliable. That argument, if it wins Khomeini's arbitration, removes the last internal Iranian constraint on the three-axis escalation plan that the carrier deployment was designed to deter. Here is the timeline as it now stands. The carrier sustainment window has approximately 3 days remaining before the deployment either escalates or retreats. The Islamabad relay is suspended, not dead, but suspended pending Washington's internal deliberation on the snapback condition. Iraqi remains in Islamabad, which means Iran has not formally withdrawn from the relay, but the Irg faction's argument to Khomeini is running in parallel, and Khomeini's arbitration does not wait for Washington's deliberation schedule. The 3-day carrier window and the Iranian internal political resolution are running simultaneously against each other, with no synchronization mechanism and no communication channel fast enough to prevent one from overtaking the other. 3 days, 2 simultaneous clocks, no channel fast enough to sync them. That is the actual state of the U.S.-Iran crisis as of this moment. Not the carrier movements, not the drone strikes, not the legal filings at the IMO, 2 clocks running into capitals against each other, with a recalled flight carrying the president's personal envoys as the visible symptom of the race between them. Here's the full picture. Trump recalled Witkoff and Kushner, not because the negotiation failed, but because Iran restructured its answer to embed a snapback condition that the personal envoy model cannot accommodate, a condition specifically designed to paralyze the commitment mechanism that made personal envoys valuable in the first place. The recall is a refusal to be maneuvered, not a retreat, but the Irg faction in Tehran is reading it as a retreat. And that reading, if it wins Khomeini's arbitration in the next 72 hours, converts a tactical diplomatic adjustment into a strategic green light for the three-axis escalation the entire preceding 6 months of Iranian military and diplomatic activity has been building toward. What did the intelligence community tell Trump in the 2 hours before the recall? That Iran had found the one condition that paralyzes personal envoys, the snapback mechanism, and embedded it in an answer designed to be received by men who couldn't handle it. The recall was the correct response to that trap. Why does sending Witkoff and Kushner specifically signal something Tehran was reading carefully? Because personal envoys are commitment mechanisms, and Iran found the exact condition that commitment mechanisms cannot commit to, which means the next move requires something that personal envoys cannot be: institutional, deniable, and slow enough to address a snapback question without triggering the personal commitment liability. That makes Witkoff and Kushner valuable in every other context. What that looks like, who carries it, and whether it arrives before the carrier window closes is the question that the next 72 hours answer, whether anyone is paying attention or not.